what is it about this command that sums up all the law and the prophets? If we think about the law in the Old Testament, there are a lot of laws about how people should live in the community, laws governing their behavior toward each other, the resolution of conflicts and disputes. There are also like ceremonial laws, purification laws. If we look at the prophets wrote for a lot of different reasons. They wrote for admonishing Israel in terms of sin, for prophesying the future for Israel. How is it that this commandment sums up the law and the prophets? Welcome to Calvary Conversations, a ministry of Calvary University where we discuss anything and everything from the biblical worldview. I am Tim Hange, the chair of the English department at Calvary University, one of your four co-hosts. I have with me Josh Paxton, who is the head of our missions studies at Calvary University, Sean LePage, who is the head of ministry studies at Calvary University and a professor as well, and Mike Dodds, who's also a ministry studies and professor and the head of CU Press. So we are pleased today to be actually talking about a really core passage regarding the biblical worldview. You know, there are a lot of these pivotal verses in Scripture that really sum up how we are supposed to think and how we are supposed to live. There are several amazing ones that often come to mind for believers, and this one is no exception. The great commandment, it's called, and I can read the Mark 12 version of this for a little bit of context before we dive into it. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" Jesus answered, "The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." And the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one and that there is no other beside him, and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." So we look at this commandment. There are three versions of this commandment. We have one in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John gives us a different new commandment. He didn't say greatest commandment. In John 13, the command to love one another. But we're going to focus really on this greatest commandment, and the second commandment is like it, or as it says in some renditions or some passages, or versions, I mean. So let's get to the core of this. You know, there is another version of this that says that in these two commandments, all the law and all the prophets are summed up. And I want to ask, what is it about this command that sums up all the law and the prophets? If we think about the law in the Old Testament, there are a lot of laws about how people should live in the community, laws governing their behavior toward each other, the resolution of conflicts and disputes. There are also like ceremonial laws, purification laws. If we look at the prophets wrote for a lot of different reasons. They wrote for admonishing Israel in terms of sin, for prophesying the future for Israel. How is it that this commandment sums up the law and the prophets?
Well, isn't it for sure that he's reflecting the Shema, for Israel? Right, this is their key concept. This is what they say when they gather to worship. You shall love the Lord your God. I mean, they quote Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 is what Christ is quoting here. So in that sense, it's that summary father law, grandfather law, whatever they would classify it as, that which determines the whole law. It's pivotal.
Yeah, and
It,
I think the
oh,
key word is love. You know, love is what actually fulfills the law. That the love is why you know, all of the what is it he says, the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, because the, you know, the real clear connecting word is love. And so ultimately, um you know, the commands are about love for God and love for people, and that's the simple way to understand these laws, you know. Like you know, we may not fully understand how certain laws in the law of Moses, or you know, one of the, whatever it is, 613 commands, you know, we may not understand clearly how all of those relate to um our love for God and our love for people. But ultimately, I think that's what God is saying by or what Jesus is saying by making this connection, is that ultimately obeying God is how we express our love for Him. And 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 so and God gave those laws um, uh, out of love for His people. So I just think that, you know, you can't really understand any of this without really focusing on the key word of love.
Mhm. Yeah.
I like that, Sean. And I as I think about this, there's a directional motivation that is intrinsic here. And you think about you know, the law is an external command. You do these things in order to be obedient, in order to please somebody, in order to not be punished. I mean, frankly, we like, right, I want to drive the speed limit because I don't want to get a speeding ticket. And that's an external motivator. However, what Jesus is really pointing to here is more of an internal motivation of, no, I don't just drive the speed limit because I'm worried about getting a speeding ticket. I drive the speed limit because I want to be safe and I want to keep my family safe. And I have more of a internal, all right, motivator for doing those things. And I'm trying to collect all of my thoughts here. But so, okay, Tim will recognize this. Tim and I had a pastor who liked to tell a story of how he, you know, the husband would do something for his wife, and the wife would be like, "Wow, thank you so much," and the husband would respond, "Well, it's my duty."
mm-hmm.
Like, how's the wife supposed to take that, right? Like, and so you don't do these things for your spouse because of an external, right? You do the thing because you have the internal motivation. You have that internal desire to be pleasing and to love them. And so love fulfills the law because the motivation for doing it is more accurate, is more correct than simply, I don't want to be punished.
Well, so you're talking about love fulfilling the law, and I think this is a question that I wrestled with, and if I'm going to be honest with, I still wrestle with a bit. One of the key like sticking points for like the Judeo-Christian theology is what happens when Christ comes. You know, he says, "I've not come to abolish the law; I've come to fulfill the law." And yet we don't follow the Mosaic law today. By and large, we see ourselves as freed from it. We have examples. For instance, Peter saw the vision in which he was directed to eat the unclean meat, and God said, "I've sanctioned this now as clean." And so there's a sense to where Christians say, well, you know, the old law just doesn't really matter anymore. It's just you know, it's Jesus kind of came and just changed the rules completely, gave us a new kind of law. But I'm curious because I see this commandment as kind of at the intersection of that, because of its reference to Old Testament law, the Shema. Uh, Also, just bluntly, I'm an English professor, and I don't spend as much
Oh
time
dear.
ruminating about these things. So my questions are very sincere here, actually. How do you explain to somebody, guys, uh, how Jesus fulfills the law without
Hmm.
abolishing it, right? As he said, I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And how is the great commandment tied up in that story?
Mhm. It's a big question in ethics when we approach Christian ethics, when we approach the Old Testament, and where does the law fit in? And we all see three distinguishing kinds of law in the Old Testament, and we say, no, we're not under the ceremonial law. That's clearly said in the New Testament, but yet Jesus says he came to fulfill the law. And there's that moral part of it. The problem with ethics and the Old Testament, in a sense, is it's not three divisions of the Old Testament, it's three strands that fit in the Old Testament together. So the discussions go long and hard. But I think what Christ is referring to here at a time when the law was still operative is more a correction to them. Are they actually doing the sentiment of that? And we can definitely argue about the ceremonial law and the fulfillment of Christ and his sacrifices on the cross and what he came to do. And that's for sure. But even in there, there's that fulfillment that now we fulfill as a relationship with Christ. All right, I'm wandering around a little bit, but yeah, Tim, you've touched on a question that we all struggle with because of statements in the New Testament. But it's clear, I think, summary-wise, it's clear there are parts of the law that we're just clearly pointing forward to Christ. But yet what we're talking about here, whether you call it the moral law, that which we must always do, that Christ repeated, and even after, if you take a strict, almost a hyper-dispensational viewpoint of what he's saying here, before there's things that Christ said that don't apply to us, some people would say, no, these apply to us because they're supracultural. We are to love the Lord our God, though there's a given context that's different. And now the dispensational thinking comes in. All right, I'm wandering around a little bit, but we have to be clear in how we think through the Old Testament.
Well, I think Mike is right that this is a complex, very complex, and I'm looking forward to a whole series of conversations about this. But my take on this is that Jesus fulfilled the law by doing what we could not do.
Yeah. Right.
So ultimately, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, I believe that's impossible. And I think that that's what Israel showed us, was that it was impossible. They couldn't do it. And the Mosaic covenant, under which God gave the law, was conditional, and the people were supposed to keep their side of things, if you will, and they failed, because ultimately this is impossible. It is obviously something we should strive for, but I think it's impossible. So the New Testament teaches that we are not under the law, but under grace. And so I think that doesn't mean that we're lawless. It means that we are under a new administration. Thank God we are under a new administration, because as Israel has shown us, we can't do this one. We can't do the law. We can't fulfill the law. And so we are now under grace. And so again, that doesn't mean that we're lawless, but that means that we don't have to place ourselves under or obey the law of Moses, the Old Testament law, but we are under the timeless and absolute morality of God, which is true throughout human history. So you look at someone like Noah, who was a righteous man. Noah lived before the law. Abraham lived before the law, and he believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And Abraham was a righteous man before the law. So the law isn't necessary for us to be righteous before God. salvation has always been by grace through faith, and I believe sanctification has always been by faith in God and in his absolute and timeless moral standards. So we're not under that law, but we're under grace.
Yeah, but let me just piggyback on my comment by taking another step. When the Old Testament saints had the law handed down to them, it came in the form of the 2 tablets, the 10 Commandments. And I remember as a child growing up, when you said the Old Testament law, I always thought of the 10 Commandments, that how they could all be fulfilled in that. And yeah, they are fulfilled in that. And it is all an expression. Even the ceremonial law, like you're talking, Sean, that Christ fulfilled. We could not fulfill righteousness. Christ did. And all that even looked at him pictured that. So there is that sense in which we could even look at law as the 10 Commandments and focus it down there, even though the Jew, when they said law, they thought of the 613 and all those extra laws too, that the Pharisees added to make sure they didn't violate all those that were in Scripture. They're all summarized in Christ, which brings us to a love relationship with God that was pictured in this Shema that Tim started us out with.
There's definitely a degree here to which I want to understand this more before I dive in. But and one of the questions that comes into my mind, and maybe we sometimes presume this rather than really do the research into it, is to understand what the crowd that Jesus would have understood when Jesus meant the law. So when Jesus said the law, would the cultural context of his day have understood that to refer to, the 613 or the 10 or the totality? Like, how would they have actually understood that in the cultural context of what he was saying? But
and in the cultural context that they viewed him as a lawbreaker.
Right.
Right.
So
and he was saying, no, there's actually a unifying law that I am fulfilling.
And so, and there's also, and I would want to dive into the Hebrew and Greek of this, but he contrasts abolishing it and fulfilling it. And well, to abolish something would mean you just took it and you tore it up and you threw it in the trash. But we're not going to pay any attention to that anymore. But that's not what Jesus did. Jesus came and he lived the perfect sinless life. He fulfilled all of the obligations of the law. And then as a perfect sinless sacrifice, having done what we could not do, he went to the cross. Right. He fulfilled all of that in going to the cross. And so now our faith is in the one who could do what we could never do. So it's not that he ripped it up and threw it away. He fulfilled it, doing what we couldn't do, so that now our faith is in the one who did it, who could fulfill it when we can't.
And now this is the way that I interpret this passage too, because I think this has a lot of parallels with the Sermon on the Mount. We are now free to obey the law in its spirit without an overemphasis on form. However, as Sean pointed out, this may initially seem easier, but it's actually quite a bit harder, because to truly love our neighbor as ourselves is an incredibly difficult thing. And to truly love the Lord with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength is an incredibly difficult thing. And this is a good transition to my next question, which is a bit of a shift, but I want to look at the wording of this command. Do you think that the command is basically love the Lord with your whole person? Or do you think it's a reading too much into it to suggest that heart, soul, mind, and strength were intentionally divided in the utterance of this command? Knowing also that one version of this command in Matthew does not include the word strength, it's heart and soul and mind. And the Luke passage and the John passage do heart, soul, mind, and strength. Mike, help me out here. Is in the Deuteronomy Shema, what is it? How is that one referenced?
In the Masoretic text, heart, soul, and strength. One question I had, just to emphasize the discipline that we have, we try to compare all the scriptures. We observe first what's going on. One of the questions that I had is one of these translations a little closer to the Septuagint? Does that make any difference? Doesn't seem to, as I track that question back. All right, that's one thing when we look across scripture. Is Matthew, he's the one that does not include strength. Is his perspective unique in that he's the one who says all the law and the prophets hang on these commandments? Perhaps so. I'd want to do some more digging, as Josh is saying. Just looking at the wording here, all of them are tracking across the same Greek terms. So we don't have a difference there. It's just that Matthew throws us a little bit of a curveball, and then we look at the Septuagint, it's a little different.
Right.
So, good question, though. We do word studies and see if that's a significant.
Another question would become: Is there a reason that it's different because of his reason for writing the book? Like all four of the gospel writers, we recognize that they had different purposes in writing their particular gospels. They focus on different things, and so is the distinction in this command because Matthew's purpose is slightly different than Mark's and Luke's and John's.
It could be. That's what I was wondering. The Septuagint or the Shema only has 3 elements instead of 4: heart, soul, and strength. Doesn't have mind. Is he following an Old Testament thought of the 3 parts there from the Shema in Deuteronomy?
Tim,
maybe another question is, why did Mark add mind?
Yeah. Well, and Luke.
Yeah.
I love this. I love digging into these textual differences and all that kind of thing. But I think ultimately back to your question, Tim, I think the answer is that is both. I think both, that we can look at these differences probably indicate that we are to love God with our entire being. I think that's kind of the overarching message. We are to love the Lord our God with all that we are. And perhaps there were differences in these lists of heart, mind, soul, and strength because everybody knew that ultimately it didn't matter whether you said heart, mind, soul, and strength. And maybe in some lists that we don't have anymore, they would have added with your heart, mind, soul, strength, and your eyes and your money and your talent and your attitude, and on and on and on. Maybe kind of like the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Are there any other things that could go in that list? I think so.
Right.
But Paul,
not exhaustive.
Paul gave us 9. I don't think that's because there are no other fruit of the Spirit, but because he was giving us plenty to chew on. And I think that's true with this Shema is, start with mind, soul, heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then move on from there, because there's plenty in the scriptures that would say, love the Lord your God with your money. Love the Lord your God with your time. Love the Lord your God with your attitude. Love the Lord your God with other things as well. So I think it's absolutely correct to say that he's saying, love the Lord your God with everything you are, but also that we would look at each one of these areas of our lives, every aspect of our being, and really, pursue the idea of loving God with these very specific and distinctive parts of who we are, including my heart, which probably was kind of focused on just the kind of the moral center of who I am, versus the mind, which is the intellect and the reasoning and so forth. So I think both are legitimate ultimately.
See, that's I gotta come back to this real quick because so Matthew, I think we generally perceive as being written to a Jewish audience, and his repetition of this accurately reflects what is in the Great Shema in Deuteronomy 6:5. And then Mark, a companion of Paul, Luke, a companion of Paul, both of them who would have been involved in ministry primarily to Gentiles through that relationship, in their version of it, they both add mind, which speaks to the purpose in writing, if they're writing predominantly to a Gentile audience, where they might want to emphasize the intellect, they might want to emphasize the mind in writing to that particular audience.
Yeah, maybe we should add in a technical thing that we need to be careful as we do exegesis of the passage. Christ is saying all these things. He said all four things. It isn't just that one gospel author thought, well, I'll add the word mind too.
Right,
We're not saying that for sure. But why did Matthew selectively keep out one term? That's a question that we have to ask, and Josh is getting right onto it. We compare all the gospel accounts. Are there several times Jesus was asked this question, or is this all of the one occasion? That's one. We're just talking about exegesis here. We got to figure that out. And if so, why did the author? So Josh asked the great question: why would an author write it the way he did? And again, it's probably the emphasis for the audience. It meant so much more to them than it would to the other audience of the other gospel writer, in this case, Matthew.
And that's interesting. In Luke, in Luke's version, it's not Jesus who says it.
Yeah.
So the lawyer is the one who actually makes the statement about loving the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus commends him for that statement.
Right.
Well, Jesus said it all in Mark, so maybe he's quoting Jesus.
Sure. Well, but you raise a good you raise a good question, Mike, which is are these different records of it being repeated in different times? There's Jesus has 3 years of ministry here. It stands to reason that he probably said it more than once, and somebody else probably heard him and repeated it back to him at some point as well.
Yep.
What it doesn't necessarily say to us is that it's a contradiction or a mistake.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Obviously,
absolutely.
And that's why I say, perhaps in other discussions, perhaps with a different kind of Jewish leader or a different kind of Gentile leader, maybe they would add more things, to this list of the specifics and distinctions in who we are. But it doesn't. This is not some sort of contradiction or mistake. This is. I believe the best explanation is what Mike said, that Jesus talked about this more than once, and he didn't need to include heart, mind, soul, and strength every time. That wasn't necessary. Everybody knew the Shema. Everybody knew that the Old Testament had laws that related to the heart and the soul and the mind and the strength or the physical body, and so they didn't need to fill all those in every time when they talked about it.
Yeah, I just pulled off my shelf Harmony of the Gospels, and there's 2 different versions I have, and both of them seem to imply that the Luke account is a different time because it's separate. They don't include it with the Mark and Matthew. There are too many differences, even though there are a lot of similarities in the passage. So doing good exegesis here, guys.
I want to point out to our listenership right now, this is what we do at Calvary. This is the kind of thing we stand around talking about. And I would encourage you, if you're thinking about an education at Calvary, like what you just witnessed today is actually, this is the kind of thing we'll stand around. I had a couple of faculty over for lunch a couple of weeks ago, and we ended up just digging into a passage in a very similar way, just at my home. And it was really a wonderful thing. I would encourage you, if not with us, have these kinds of conversations with other believers. If you're in a group of believers and you're not bringing up these topics, why? I mean, why not? it's this is the kinds of things that our minds should be dwelling on and ruminating on as we are steering our thoughts and our understanding to the Lord. And I do want to, just in the 5 minutes we have left, I do want to point out one, that we are going to be doing, this is the kickoff to a series in which we're going to be examining what it means to love the Lord with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I'm really looking forward to the series, but I wanted to kind of maybe tease the series a little bit at first by asking each of you a question, which is, which one are you looking forward the most to discussing and why? And you can give a little bit of reason, but don't give us all of it, because we want to save it for, save the whole discussion. But so for me, for example, it would be loving the Lord with your mind. This is something that I am deeply concerned about in modern Christianity. There are a lot of people who seem to think that faith and reason are divorced, that faith is kind of sort of a different thing than fact. I think a lot of well-meaning people say things to this effect. I think that we don't understand that loving the Lord with our mind is more than just not thinking impure thoughts. It has to do with the habits of our mind, being honest, being intellectually careful, being curious, being tenacious. These are all things that are part of our intellectual character. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. What about you guys? And I don't know. I didn't ask these guys ahead of time, so it could be that three of you come up with the same one. That's okay. But yeah, I'd love to hear which one you guys are looking forward to discussing the most.
Well, Tim, let me say, you're right that this is what we do at Calvary, but unfortunately, it's not the only thing we do. We have a lot of other more mundane things to do with our lives. This is what we enjoy doing. This is our culture.
If only we could only do this.
But actually, it was in one of those times when we were just talking and interacting that we actually came up with this idea, and we felt like it was something that we should pursue in a detailed way, because it really, again, the word love in these commandments is so critical to see. And ultimately, God is not calling us into a relationship based on law, based on obedience and commandment. I mean, that's part of it, and that's necessary. But ultimately, he's calling us into a love relationship, and our eternal salvation doesn't hang on whether we're good lovers. It depends on the sacrifice and the grace of Jesus Christ, but our fellowship with God, our relationship with him, our communion with him, is closely connected to whether or not we love him well and whether we love other people well. So I'm excited about this, because this is just something that we already find ourselves talking about, whether we're on a Calvary conversation or not. And it's just so central to what it means to walk with God. And so I would say I'm with you on the mind. I'm really excited about that one. I think that's what actually got us on this whole conversation in the first place. But I'm looking forward to strength as well. I'd say that's probably the other one that I'm getting at, because I think it's related to our bodies and our physical being, which is often kind of considered, especially in our time. There's this split now between values and facts, or identity and physical existence or biology, and so that's a whole thing that has really gotten us to the point where men can identify as women and women can identify as men, and so forth. Because there's been this split that took place that really ultimately has devalued the body, the biology of how God made us. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that as well.
Yep. Mike, what about you? Which one are you looking forward to?
I don't have one. I have all four. Where my mind is gone, maybe it just the wild hares that I get that I want to follow and track. I'm sitting here thinking, I was reminded as we in one of the conversation of a seminary student did a THM thesis a number of years ago on conscience. But in order to study that word, he had to talk about all these other words that describe us as people. What is conscience, compared to heart and soul and mind? So I'm interested in going back into all the terms in the context of biblical anthropology. If, as Tim, what you said, this is a description of a whole person response to God. That's what love is. Should be with a whole person. I think that's a big part of it. What are these different aspects? So I'm thinking of all four. I don't have one in mind.
Josh, what about you?
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know that I necessarily have a preference. So I do, I like what you've been, and this has been a theme with you, Tim, and thinking about what it means to love the Lord with all your mind. And so I'm interested in diving into that and what you have to say about it. Soul sticks out to me a little bit, just in the sense of, especially pertaining to your question, right? Does heart, soul, mind, and strength actually refer to the whole person? And yet then soul, what is that? I don't want to get too theological and talk about trichotomous and dichotomous and the material and immaterial aspect of man. Although we might have to go down that route, but yeah, what does it mean to specifically love the Lord your God with this seemingly immaterial part of our being that we don't necessarily fully understand?
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to the series, and thank you guys so much for being part of this conversation today, and thank you all for watching. We really appreciate you. We would love to hear from you. Wherever you have seen this content, there should be some way of getting in touch with us. So I encourage you to do so. At the very least, come to our website and you can find our contact information and let us know if you have any thoughts or any questions. We really would encourage you to continue this conversation, but I would say not so much with us, with the other believers in your community. Get together, read the Word of God, discuss it. It is rich, it is powerful. If you're not part of a group that's doing that, find a group that is doing that. Thank you so much for joining us here at Calvary Conversations. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.